Welcome to the Spring Writing Workshop at the Rancho Santa Fe Senior Center. My name is Garrett Chaffin-Kirai. This is the June edition 2020, and our focus today is dialogue, but in particular the short story Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. On our way to talking about Hemingway's story, I wanted to offer a few breadcrumbs, which are things you might read, watch, and hear based on my introduction and experience over the last several weeks. In particular, the things you might consider reading include the Dune House Atreides novel by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, Station 11, a novel by Emily St. John Mandel. You might watch the movie 9 to 5 from 1980, the movie Little Women from last fall, 2019, and you might give a listen to the podcast called WTF with Mark Maron. For me, as a sometime reader of science fiction and fantasy fiction, I've been drawn to the Dune Chronicles since I was a wee boy of, say, 11 or 12 years old, when a sixth grade teacher introduced me to this series and suggested I might enjoy reading them. At that time and at that age, I found the original Frank Herbert novel quite intimidating but very provocative, and over the years read the rest of his existing work in the subject, and then grew off into my own adulthood and generally lost track of it, except for periodic glimpses backwards in the mirror. Among those glimpses were the fact that I became aware that his son, Brian Herbert, in collaboration with Kevin J. Anderson, began writing further novels in the Dune universe based on the father Frank Herbert's notes. I kicked around the idea of reading these, but considered them somehow secondary and ignored them. Recently, however, with the lockdown and pandemic worry about staying at home, I needed things to read and occupy myself, and decided I would give these novels a shot. I've enjoyed the first one, House Atreides. I'm now on to the second one, and I would recommend them, particularly if the Frank Herbert original series, which dates to 1965 with the Chronicle Dune, is of interest to you. I have enjoyed revisiting this universe and meeting the various characters who I remember from that early novel as much younger people before the world-making affairs of that earlier novel come true. The other novel I'd recommend is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. I have to admit that I came to this novel quite by accident. I was looking to find a copy of her more recent book called The Glass House. I couldn't find it at my local library when they were still lending. I couldn't find it at my local bookstore for curbside pickup. And kicking around, I did find this copy of an earlier work of hers, and I was confused about its plot. I remember when it was published and hearing things about it, but I had kind of misfiled that in my brain. Brought this home, began reading it, and here's the bottom line. It is a pandemic novel, published in 2014, postulating that the world will be overrun by a flu-like disease that kills upwards of 95.5% of the population. And we're thinking about a group of survivors who deal with the fallout of the fall of our civilization as we know it, but a generation after that has already happened. I think it's worth taking a look at, particularly if you're attuned to the way that creative people deal with the problems of society at any one time. In terms of movies over the last month or so, I have revisited 9 to 5. I've done this in the context of a Saturday night movie watching group that I periodically bump into with some friends. We've been doing this for roughly 5 years or so. It tends to be a smorgasbord of different topics and themes we explore as a group across several months, and recently it was just free-for-all, whatever you wanted to select. And somebody in the group had never seen 9 to 5, brought it to the table, and we all watched it together in our remote situation at home, texting one another as we went. 9 to 5, if you haven't seen it ever, or haven't seen it in the 40 years since it was first released, is the story of three downtrodden women workers in an office that is lorded over by a very chauvinistic man. Due to circumstances, they figure out a way to control the office, run things in their own way, and adopt different pioneering tactics that might make office life better. What they discover is that they have a great deal of creative energy and power, control, authority, and success running the office in his absence, although they keep him captive. The central stars are Lily Tomlin, you'll recognize Dolly Parton, and then, of course, Jane Fonda. The boss is Dabney Coleman. And, of course, the movie overall was very well augmented by the Dolly Parton hit of the same name, 9 to 5. In the years since, it's been adapted onto a stage musical, which I have not seen, but am told is pretty entertaining. The bottom line here is some of the stuff that these three women go through in negotiating their office life with their very difficult boss until they remove him is a little on the nose and frightening, particularly if a person remembers office life in the 70s and 80s. The tell here for me is the fact I was raised in a household where my mother was the primary breadwinner, working in offices over the many years of my childhood, and only around the glimpsed edges of what she would report on her workaday life did I have an understanding of the power dynamics between men and women. Difficult stuff. There is some material in the movie that is unsettling, a little bit unpleasant, leavened periodically by very good humor, and I think generally fine performances. The other movie I'd recommend is the most recent remake of Little Women by Greta Gerwig, which was released surrounding the holidays of 2019. It was roundly celebrated as a very good adaptation and revision of the underlying source novel, which you may have read as a young person, or maybe in the years since. It has a wonderful cast of very appealing young performers, and there are small twists in earlier movie versions of this novel that is done to quite good effect, at least to this viewer. On top of that, the costumes are sumptuous, the backdrops seem realistic to the particular kinds of society that we're glimpsing from the 19th century, and I found it overall a very winning movie that I'd strongly recommend to you. As part of my daily exercise, I've been taking long walks simply to leave home and explore the world and be alone with my thoughts. But of course I bring along podcasts, and one of these podcasts I've recently bumped into is the one you see on screen there, WTF with Mark Maron. This isn't for the faint of heart in the sense that Mark Maron is a mid to late 50-ish long-term stand-up comedian. His language can be purple from time to time. In fact, if you look up WTF, you'll discover that it is profane. So I mean to put that out in front of you. The guy does have colorful language from time to time. He's also quite wicked smart. He's also a pretty good interviewer from time to time, and he's been at this project, this podcast, since 2009. It's an outcropping of some earlier radio work he was doing around the edges of being a comedian, but here's my point. In the last month, his live-in girlfriend, who had been in his life for about 1 year as a romantic partner, became dramatically sick very suddenly and died, not due to COVID, which is fortunate from one angle, but is terrible from another because she had an undiagnosed blood-borne disorder. I became aware of that through just public news sources, while at the same time, over the last several weeks, I have been listening to his podcasts as he interviews various figures, largely in entertainment, but periodically dipping into other walks of life, including, about 4 years ago, interviewing our former President Obama. The thing I found provocative while taking my walks is listening to a person suffer and deal with the fact of his loss quite openly in a real-time circumstance. In effect, his girlfriend, this woman filmmaker called Lynn Shelton, died, I think, on a Friday, and his habit has been to put out new episodes of this podcast every Monday and every Thursday, and he has continued to do that while acknowledging and talking about and exploring the difficulties of this terrible event that has happened to him, acknowledging the kindness of strangers, and dealing with the pain and anguish of what it is to lose and lose terribly. Now, as you go back through his archive, should this guy's voice and pattern be of interest to you, you'll discover that he's a very light and interesting guy, doing all kinds of funny things, interviewing all kinds of interesting guests. But I have found the poignancy of his struggle with loss to be quite remarkable, insomuch as I've paused in the shade of trees while on those daily walks to really listen to what his words are and thinking about what he has experienced in terms of love, what he has lost because the source of that love, this woman Lynn, is no longer with him, but then the fact that the memory of what they established together can linger with him now forever. I have found all of that quite warming and also quite terrifying because it is something that will visit us all. So then we turn to our subject at hand, which is Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. By Notes of History, this was first published in August of 1927 in a small literary magazine called Transition, and later that year it was included as one of several short stories in the Hemingway collection, Men Without Women, which I believe has been in print ever since. It is widely available through the web. If you have never read it before in its entirety, know that it's a pretty short story. I suspect that a typical reader will get through it in less than 15 minutes, perhaps less than 10. It really isn't that long a piece of work, and it's widely available in PDF forms, EPUB documents, and as I said, in various collections over time. You'll also find, if you should Google this story and this writer, a number of different people, including yours truly, who've tried to offer remarks of analysis and interpretation, celebration, and criticism of what this story is all about. In at least one encounter, I've discovered people who've read it aloud, helping it last 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the reader and the pace of their natural speech. All of that to one side, I do think it recommends itself to the casual reader of American literature because Ernest Hemingway is one of our huge celebrated figures. A few things about him of note, if you haven't refreshed yourself in Hemingway stuff. The man was born in 1899, lived to 1961 when he took his own life, and in between enjoyed and suffered through various world historic experiences, including volunteer service in World War I as an ambulance driver, working around the scenes of supporting the rebels in the Spanish Civil War. I believe he was married 4 different times. I believe he fathered at least 3 children. He lived through various experiences of personal tragedy and pain involving accidents and injuries. He also was likely clouded in a whole fury of different neurological and mental disorders, which we might now name differently than was the case then, but certainly a very manic and depressive person, a very addictive personality who was difficult to be around, but definitely one of the main voices of American literature in the years of his life. He became known for promoting a particular strategy of writing, the iceberg theory, which is to suggest that most of what we should accomplish in our writing is small compared to everything that might be underneath it if we just simply allow the words that we select and present to a viewing and reading public to be the right words in the right space. More on that as we move along. A few things about this story. One, it has a generally simple synopsis. What we experience is an American man and a young woman, who he refers to as girl, as they drink and talk at a small Spanish train station as they await a train which will take them to the city of Madrid. The girl, while in conversation, compares the nearby hills to white elephants. They talk around the fact of what's really on their mind, and they directly talk about going off to the city for an operation. What they indirectly don't talk about, but we infer, is what that operation is, and the suggestion through years of interpretation is that he is pushing her to go get an abortion so they can continue to enjoy their life as a young couple, enjoying the pleasures of flesh and feast without the obligations of marriage or family life. As we enter into thinking about this story more closely, I do want to present a couple of ideas that may be of interest. These bracket into 2 broad categories. The first is the uses of dialogue, and the second is the valuable attributes of dialogue. First up, uses of dialogue. When people write dialogue, as Hemingway does in this story, there are 5 main areas of its value to us as readers, and one is simple exposition, a character explaining who they are as they introduce themselves to another character, as they ask for something in a preference they may have for food or drink or living condition or an item they wish to buy at a store. A character offers expository remarks in the dialogue that they speak. The second thing that a character presents through their dialogue is the background. We learn where they are. We learn when they are. We learn what the tendencies are in the society around them, and we hear in their references what their class position may be, what they may be in terms of age, background, and training. The third thing that dialogue often offers us is an acceleration through story. And here let's just put a fine point on it. Dialogue versus expository prose tends to have a lot of white space around it. Dialogue tends to move very quickly down a page, and as a reader, we accelerate through dialogue because we can chew it up very quickly. This is helpful because it does put on the accelerator for a reader who's moving through a bit of text. This acceleration moves us through the story physically because we do indeed flip pages faster, but this acceleration also brings with it the dynamic of how people sometimes interact with one another when they're live in sparkling conversation. There is also a fourth tendency in the use of dialogue, and that is specific character development. As characters speak, they will very often refer to their personal histories, they will make preferences, they will suggest things that they know about exclusively, they will have jokes, they will have insights that their immediate intimates will understand and that strangers will not. This tendency strongly mirrors the way that if we're eavesdropping on people conversing around us, say in a park, a restaurant, a line, we will hear them say things we don't fully understand specifically, but we can intuit that the people in conversation know something very deeply about one another, and this deep inside knowledge they have of one another speaks to who they are. There's a fifth status or use of dialogue, and that is relational status. People in conversation, like characters in written work in conversation, are constantly reiterating the patterns of how they relate. Who has greater and lesser authority? Who has greater and less control? Who is the prime mover in a relationship? And who is more subordinate? These five uses of dialogue, again, they are exposition, background, acceleration, character development, and relational status, all pile in to thoughtful dialogue. But there's this too. The valuable attributes of dialogue that we can drill into even more specifically go like this. Speech in dialogue, in stories, is a form of action. Very often when we think of people taking action in the world of our real, we think about throwing balls, we think about lifting objects, digging ditches, throwing things around, etc. But in a story, we're imagining all of this action, and further, we have to imagine that part of what the action in a story is speech. People can very specifically say things to hurt or to heal one another. So speech is a kind of action. It needs to be thought of that way. So the gestures that people use while speaking also matter. That's the second iteration of valuable attributes of dialogue. Just as a person who is an animated speaker may wildly swing their hands to emphasize a point, characters can do that too on the written page if they are written to do so. They can gesture to emphasize their thoughts, to express discomfort, to express affection or joy or rapture or nervousness. A third thing is there is an insight into context when there is a sense of valuable attribution in dialogue. Dialogue also lets us understand where we are because characters who gesture may also pause and notice something about the world in which they are situated. They may notice wallpaper, the change in cloud structure, the sudden change in music in a restaurant, the wafting over of a pleasant smell. So context, along with gesture, can impact how and in what ways people speak. Fourth, people speak in their vernacular. This is true in our everyday speech. There are particular forms of slang, there are particular conjugates of profane words that I personally enjoy, and in conversation they form my particular vernacular, which defines me. In similar fashion, there are many regionalisms and dialects and accents of speech which denote who we are, where we are from, when we are from, and characters in dialogue will often use these different aspects of their vernacular to express more closely who they are. Finally, a valuable attribute of dialogue is this: silence. The inability or unwillingness to express speech has impact. If you can imagine any time in your life when you've had a heated argument or disagreement with somebody, where words get exchanged and suddenly there are no more words left to use, the punctuation of that silence, sometimes that silence wins over the point or further emphasizes something of great power in the argument that you are having. So again, Valuable attributes of dialogue, besides the specific uses of dialogue, include speech as action, gesture as part of what people say inside of a context, using their vernacular, and finally punctuated by the potential for silence. I want to begin now by offering a few excerpts from this story, Hills Like White Elephants, to express some ideas about Hemingway and dialogue. The opening of this story is a blocky expository paragraph. Let me read that aloud and then drift into the dialogue, and then I'll begin offering some comments to you. Hills like white elephants. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station there was the warm shadow of the building and a curtain made of strings of bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this junction for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. "What should we drink?" the girl asked. She had taken off her hat and put it on the table. "It's pretty hot," the man said. "Let's drink beer." "Dos cervezas," the man said into the curtain. "Big ones?" a woman asked from the doorway. "Yes, 2 big ones." In this opening movement of this story, we're beginning to see the evidence of what Hemingway termed the iceberg theory, an idea that the facts of a story float above water like the tip of an iceberg, leaving beneath the surface of the water the surface of the story in this metaphor, the supporting structure, symbolism, all of the material that makes the facts of what's happening more vivid and more interesting. In this example, what we're hearing is an isolated way station between locations, a spot that is liminal, where nobody goes to be there permanently, but is caught in transport from one place to another, from one place in life to another place in life, from one thing of sturdiness to another place of sturdiness. But in this shallow place, this train station, a person is, in a way, kind of lost. We know that it's hot. We know that there's a particular attribute of mountains nearby, that there are these rails, and that this man and this woman, called girl, that's a pointed word, are there to hang out and wait. And to occupy their time, they're going to drink beer. He nominally knows a little bit of Spanish in order to order the beers, and they're asking for quite a lot, big ones. These words and their selection, just in these first 8 or 10 lines of the story, do give us some insights into these people. They're not drinking lemon water or straight water or something to refresh the fact they may be parched from the heat, the warmth, and the raw sun. Instead, they're looking for the escape of alcohol in order to relax, to party, to provide some kind of liquid refreshment that will bring them closer together, because that's a way they socialize. This suggests something deep about them that is quite noteworthy. We haven't been told that they're luscious, that they're alcoholic, that they party too hard. We haven't been told that, but what we have been told is they want 2 big beers in this particular train station while they wait. The woman brought 2 glasses of beer and 2 felt pads. She put the felt pads and the beer glasses on the table and looked at the man and the girl. The girl was looking off at the line of the hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. "They look like white elephants," she said. "I've never seen one," the man drank his beer. "No, you wouldn't have." Here's a couple of interesting things. 1. Each time there is a narrative tag to tell us who is speaking in this story, the word said is used. She said, he said, the server said. We don't have somebody exclaiming. We don't have somebody screaming. We don't have any of those unusual words. We have an abbreviated basic idea, said. What we then refer to after the narrative tag is offered, he said, she said, they said, is what the words themselves were. In this brief exchange, they look like white elephants. I've never seen one. No, you wouldn't have. Because of this pointed phrase, they look like white elephants, which refers and informs, of course, the title of the story, we are asked to think about what that can mean. What are white elephants? We know from nature, if we've studied zoology very much, that white elephants tend to be rare. They tend to have darker coloration. And this rarity is what the man is remarking on. I've never seen one. We know then what she's referring to is not just these mountains, but the rarity of what they are going through somehow or other. And we also know the man is somehow dismissive. I've never seen one. The man drank his beer. He's gesturing, informing us of circumstance rather than fully dealing with the remarks of his companion. We move along with these people. They're lovely hills, she said. They don't really look like white elephants. I just meant the coloring of their skin through the trees. Should we have another drink? All right. We hear her, a few lines on, referring back to these hills. And we also hear him, let's drink more. Let's avoid introspection. Let's not consider what's really on the table, but instead dive deeper into our escape. The beer is nice and cool, the man said. It's lovely, the girl said. Again, these narrative tags, said, speaking very briefly and factually about the circumstances while hinting at the fact that there is something deeper that we're digging into with the course of this story. I love you now. You know I love you. I know, but if I do it, then it will be nice again if I say things are like white elephants, and you'll like it. I'll love it. I love it now, but I just can't think about it. You know how I get when I worry. If I do it, you won't ever worry? 4 lines of dialogue further on in the story. No longer given over to a narrative tag that explicitly tells us who is speaking, but the interplay is starting to share with us a dynamic. He is offering to her the sort of straightforward idea, you control the decisions you make for yourself. I'll support you, but not really meaning it. And her offering back to him, I want to do things that will make you happy so we can become the people that we were when we arrived at this train station. I don't care about me. Well, I care about you. Oh yes, but I don't care about me, and I'll do it, and then everything will be fine. I don't want you to do it if you feel that way. He's playing a card, and she's answering that card. And many critics over the many years since this story was first published have wrestled over these kinds of lines to determine whether Hemingway's intention was to celebrate this woman and her agency making choices for herself, or whether, in fact, this is a story of misogyny. It's hard to say exactly, because in the end, it plays through and it plays through. They sat down at the table, and the girl looked across at the hills on the dry side of the valley, and the man looked at her and at the table. You've got to realize, he said, that I don't want you to do it if you don't want to. I'm perfectly willing to go through with it if it means anything to you. Doesn't it mean anything to you? We could get along. Of course it does. But I don't want anybody but you. I don't want anyone else. And I know it's perfectly simple. Here, he's emphasized the deep structure of what's on his mind. I don't want to be a father. I don't want the complications of family. What I want is the fun we already have, and nothing more. It is enough. It is my preference. It is my desire. Agree with me, and I'm going to work on you, and I'm going to work on you until you do agree with me. The story moves on, and it moves on, and then towards the end, what we hear is this. The train is coming in 5 minutes. The girl smiled brightly at the woman to thank her. I'd better take the bags over to the other side of the station, the man said. She smiled at him. All right, then come back and we'll finish the beer. He picked up the 2 heavy bags and carried them around the station to the other tracks. He looked up the tracks but could not see the train. Coming back, he walked through the bar room where people waiting for the train were drinking. He drank an anise at the bar and looked at the people. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. He went out through the bead curtain. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. Do you feel better? He asked. I feel fine, she said. There's nothing wrong with me. I feel fine. And what we're left with at the conclusion of the story, and that was it, the conclusion, is the fact that there is an ambiguity about what her decision will be about this operation that she's going to have when they get to the city. But we do have the understanding that there is some kind of peace that is befalling each of them in their separate quarters. While toiling to take their luggage, he stopped to get a drink and settled himself, while she was left alone and similarly settled herself while looking at these hills like white elephants. A few things of note as we conclude this set of remarks about the story. One, it's very simple in terms of sentence construction. Hemingway is known for being a particular kind of stylist who ritualistically composed sentences in their very simplest format. Many people have conjectured widely why he did this, and he was asked about it through the course of his life. But one takeaway is that this structure of simple sentences is very understandable to a relatively unsophisticated reader and listener. He does not strain the brain to come up with an understanding of what he means. It is fairly understandable. It is fairly specific. The sentences are short. So too is the dialogue that he writes. His point, I believe, is to suggest the nature of how things look on a surface, and through the careful selection of those words which express a surface, hint at what is down below, roiling, bubbling, making people and places the things that we encounter through this very simple-seeming line of dialogue, this very simple-seeming line of exposition. I know that when I was a young person, first being exposed to literature as a serious subject of study in middle school and in high school, Hemingway's work was handed to all of us because it was understandable even to the kid with the slowest reading capability and the lowest vocabulary. Deliberately, Hemingway seems to have always written and aimed his work at the reading level of a 10 to 14-year-old child who is conventionally literate, but not necessarily too sophisticated in worldview and not too learned in terms of vocabulary, and done so in order to sweep all of us into the affairs of his stories and help us understand people in a limited way dealing with their circumstances. And this story, The Hills Like White Elephants, is remarkable simply because it has two main speaking parts. And yes, there is a server who comes in and out periodically to drop off drinks or accept new orders, but really we have two people hammering each other with seemingly simple remarks that are driving home the fact of who they are. Something has come between them. They're divided about what to do about it, and this thing that's come between them can be solved with outside intervention involving surgery. This outside intervention will, they recognize, indissolubly change what and who they are to one another, but they must take action, either to accept the consequences of the new situation they are in this weird train station between points, or destroy what's now brewing between them. This is why, although the word abortion is never once raised as a specific thing, is commonly how the story is interpreted, and they go back and forth to hammer on these ideas with this aggressive and this passive relationship, and they drink beer, and they drink absinthe, and they sit in the heat and stew in their feelings without explicitly saying exactly what's on their mind or what we may need to know as readers of the text. In short, then, dialogue inside of a story is not just people rattling on the way that we may talk to people in the line while we're at the grocery store. No, dialogue ideally is trying to accelerate a story through its points, to develop its plot, to envelop us in its world, to share with us who these characters are, what's on their mind, what they are doing in the service of moving things along, and not always telling us every last darn thing, so we can for ourselves interpret and imagine what may be there. And that, in the end, may be Hemingway's great gift, helping us try to figure out what we believe is going on, knowing that our interpretations may in fact be richer than what he had intended. And there's the fact also, he may just have been a guy impatient while composing and wanting to move on to the next thing, and we are the ones dressing it up with greater complexities. So, give Hemingway a chance if you haven't seen him in a while, and pull him off the shelf. See if his work proves agreeable. And you might begin with this one, which, as I say, is widely available on the web. It's basically enjoyable, and I think you'll get through it rather quickly.